We're wrapping up the High Renaissance today, that era of the 1480s until about 1520, with two really fine works that exemplify the era quite well. Raphael's School of Athens and Josquin des Prés' motet, his sacred music composition, Ave Maria Virgo Serena. We're in that High Renaissance era, which, as I've said before, represents the high point of the era. And as we will see, it really sets the standard for later eras. Several times throughout the rest of the semester, we will look back as we're looking, for example, at the paintings of Monet or the works of Picasso. We'll be sort of using the Renaissance as a standard, as a reference point to say, what did they follow in terms of the developments that the Renaissance had worked so hard toward, things like perspective, shading, subject matter, all of those kinds of things. We'll be asking several times, what did later generations pull from the Renaissance to use, and in what ways did they depart from it? And so we will be seeing the Renaissance as setting very much of a standard. We have highlighted on several occasions that during the Renaissance, the focus is on the mind and on beauty. And I'm glad actually that today both of these works are with us here, because they both in their own way are doing that. Raphael in the School of Athens and Josquin in his musical composition. They both find ways to appeal to the intellect and to be put together in ways that they really considered quite beautiful. After we talk about those two, we will begin looking at the Baroque era with an introduction and beginning to look at some works from the Baroque as well. Our first work, as I said, is Raphael's School of Athens. What we're looking at here is a room in the Vatican, in the Pope's private apartments actually, called the Room of the Signature. You'll sometimes hear it referred to as an office, other times as a library. The name really says it all, the Room of the Signature. It was a space where important documents were signed. And Raphael, who was an arch rival of Michelangelo, they both were working in Rome quite often at the same time, and they really were often in competition with one another. But Raphael was commissioned to paint the walls of this room. All four walls he was to paint, and each wall was to represent a different discipline or a different aspect of learning. By far the most famous is the panel right here, and that's going to be our focus, called the School of Athens. Here you see the complete work. Again, I'm going to be walking through, talking about artistic characteristics, as well as who many of these people are who are represented. I often like to say this is almost like some sort of a convention. It's an imaginary meeting of the minds, both people from ancient times, as we will see, as well as people from Raphael's own day. One of the interesting things is that Raphael pays homage to himself as well as to his the other two folks who make up what I like to loosely call the Big Three. Over here to the right is a sort of peeking out of the corner, looking at us, is a self-portrait of the artist himself. Here is an enlargement of that so you can see it a little bit better. Here is the young Raphael. He has kind of a black turban on his head here, and again he's looking out at the viewer. Closer to the middle, we have what seems to be a moody, stormy, kind of brooding fellow leaning against a block of marble, using it evidently, making some sketches here and using it kind of like a desk. I purposely showed you earlier a self-portrait of Michelangelo. It was done when he was an older man, but I wanted you to get familiar with his image because I knew we would be looking at this work where Raphael includes Michelangelo as well. And then up here, you also have seen this image before, Leonardo's self-portrait. We also have Leonardo represented right here in the middle. As we'll see in a moment, a couple of these folks actually worked double duty. Kind of interesting that Raphael would portray Leonardo's head, but he's actually also meaning to represent Plato. And the same thing with a Greek philosopher, Heraclitus, who is wearing the head, as it were, of Michelangelo. Here we'll see that. I just want you to get the gist of this, mostly to understand that Raphael is celebrating knowledge, and one of the ways he does that is to celebrate many of the great thinkers from the past. So let's walk through who some of the people. There are internet sources that will point out many others of these folks, but let's just look at some of the key figures represented. In the middle, we do have Plato and Aristotle. We'll see a detail of those folks in just a minute, but we have Plato again with the head of Leonardo da Vinci. Then we have Aristotle, and then we have, kind of sprawling on the steps here, the image of Socrates. Continuing on around, Raphael himself. The fellow holding the globe is the astronomer Ptolemy. Euclid, father of geometry, is here demonstrating one of his theorems. He has a compass there, and he's doing a demonstration down here with a tablet. That face also was doing double duty. It's meant to represent Euclid, but the face was recognizable to folks in Raphael's day as the architect Bramante, who was busy next door building the St. Peter's Basilica. So it's interesting we have that architect honored as well. And then we've already seen Michelangelo, and I alluded to this. Heraclitus, a Greek philosopher, is the person that is also being represented here sort of in double duty. And then Pythagoras over here to the side. So the bottom line with this is, again, celebrating knowledge, great thinkers of the past and of Raphael's own day. This work is totally painted. It is a fresco, but he is giving us the suggestion of sculpture here and here in niches or niches. We have representations suggesting that they are sculptures. This figure represents Apollo, the god of a lot of things: sunlight, rationality, of course they're valuing the mind so much, and the arts, and Minerva over here representing wisdom. Here is the detail of Plato with one of his writings as the idealist pointing to the heavens, Aristotle with one of his writings, his Ethics, the more realistic one pointing toward the earth. You can see here, before we move on, I'll point out the skillful treatment of anatomy. Many of these people are wearing lots of drapery, sort of swathed in a lot of cloth, but nevertheless, it's quite clear that Raphael was thinking in terms of proportion and also convincing stance, convincing ways of standing. So he's aware of contrapposto. It may not be quite as readily visible as with the nudes we saw, for example, with ancient Greece, but he's very skillful with anatomy, with shading, and with contrapposto pose. Here is again the detail. You see Raphael. Here you see Euclid with his compass here and the tablet. And it's interesting, and you see this throughout the work, signs of learning, books, scrolls, those kinds of things, and folks gathered around excitedly talking about and thinking about what they're learning. There's a real animation to the work, a real enthusiasm for learning, and people are often sort of clumped together to discuss ideas and to celebrate the mind. Here you see the work again. And then I want to talk about the artistic characteristics. In your notes, you have a summary of the key ideas from this work, or the key things that are going on. And we'll get to that in just a moment, but part of that talks about artistic characteristics. So I first wanted to highlight some of those. I've already mentioned a little bit, but I wanted to highlight some of those and then we'll be going through the list that you have in your notes of some of the key things that are going on with this work. So we do have contrapposto pose, this awareness of stance, having people stand in a convincing, realistic, and rather relaxed way. There's an interest in proportion, that the human forms are portrayed in a very convincing way with the relationship, for example, of the head or the arms to the rest of the body in a very careful, very logical and appropriate way. The work is very balanced and symmetrical. You can sort of imagine dividing it down the middle between Plato and Aristotle, and you have Plato and a group of folks and the imitation of a sculpture on the left, and you have Aristotle with a group of folks and a suggestion of sculpture on the right. So it's very balanced, it's very symmetrical. The treatment of anatomy, again, is very skillful, and he's using both types of perspective. We have tiles on the floor that sort of lead our eye back and let us know he's mindful of perspective, and the lines lead us back toward the distance. Folks who are further away are a bit smaller than those who are closer to us. And it's a little hard maybe to tell, but atmospheric perspective is also being used. This arch is a little lighter than those that are closer to us, as is the sky. And so it's a little bit hazier and lighter in the distance. We also have a lot of sensitivity to shading, to chiaroscuro. He's very, very sensitive. So as we've mentioned before, the artists of the High Renaissance benefited from the developments of the earlier Renaissance. And so that's what we see here. Everything that people like Masaccio had worked to achieve, Raphael is now using. It's almost like a toolkit that he has. And he has this toolkit. He's using all of these things to create his work. And so they really just become the means to an end. But he has all of these things that he knows how to do. He's benefited from the past, and he's using these very skillfully. So then coming to the list of things that are going on that you have in your notes, this work is a beautiful summary of the goals of the Italian Renaissance. It really pulls together in one work many of the things that we've been talking about. The first two are celebrating the mind and beauty. With the mind, he's highlighting the great thinkers past and present. And of course, when I say present, I mean in Raphael's day. So great thinkers, people like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, the big three artists, Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, the architect Bramante, who was living in Raphael's day. So the great thinkers, past and present. The enthusiastic love of learning. Everywhere you look, books, scrolls, tablets, and people engaged in animated conversation. So all of these things highlight the importance of the mind. And then on the preceding slide, I pointed out the artistic choices that lead to beauty. That in the Renaissance mindset, these were things that you wanted to use to make a beautiful work of art, to show your skill. Balance, anatomy, proportion, contrapposto pose, chiaroscuro, and perspective. He's using all of those things to make the work pleasing to the eye. He's also looking to the past, not only with the thinkers, but also the architecture. When you look at this architecture, it is suggestive of ancient Rome, Roman barrel vaults. It also is the way they were building St. Peter's next door. We'll be seeing that in a later lecture, which is kind of interesting, but it was meant to be a reference specifically to the ancient Roman architectural past. We also see a reference to the past with mythology. I mentioned Apollo and Minerva. Here we are at the Vatican, but this is not a Christian story. This is looking back to the pagan past. And it's interesting, the shape, just by coincidence, but the shape here is a semicircular shape, similar to what we saw with Gislibertus with his relief carving of the Last Judgment. And so in the Middle Ages, the focus was on religious works, religious subjects. And we would see some of that as well in the Renaissance and into the Baroque also. We're going to continue to see religious works being created. But in this case, it isn't. It is not. It's focusing on the great thinkers of the past, including mythological figures, and so it is not a specifically Christian work by any means. But it is looking to the past, again, with architecture, mythology, and ancient thinkers. We also have a celebration of the present with contemporary artists, the big three, and architecture similar to what we're going to see at St. Peter's. One more thing about this work, there was a sermon delivered during this time at the Vatican, and the Pope of the day was in attendance. And during that sermon, the priest made the statement, "We are the new Athens." Now, he was talking to Romans, to the folks of his day in the early 1500s. What he meant by that was that the Renaissance achievers, they were in Rome, the Renaissance achievers were picking up where the ancients left off. And in many ways, this work sort of says that. It's almost like you could almost view that as sort of a subtitle to this work. It's called the School of Athens, and what they're saying is we are the new Athens. This priest who gave the sermon meant that they were going to even greater heights. We're benefiting from the ancient past, and we're now going to take that to a new level. So what Raphael is doing here is celebrating accomplishment, old and new, the accomplishments of the past, the accomplishments of his day, and looking ahead optimistically to the accomplishments of the future. Now, we will see as we turn to music that the mind and beauty are also very important with our particular composition, Josquin des Prez, Ave Maria, Virgo Serena. I'm going to be talking about some general developments first, and then with this slide, and then I will also be talking about, in general, what the music was like. We will then talk about Josquin des Prez a little bit as a person, and then we will be focusing on this particular piece of music. I will be trying to keep in mind that it's a different circumstance now in terms of a recorded lecture where I can't as easily demonstrate things. So I'll be trying to point out general concepts that I want you to understand. And some of those are actually already typed for you in the notes, but some general things about music in this time period that I want you to understand. Please also do remember that you have a playlist, and there's a very nice YouTube recording of our featured piece, and you'll want to listen to that a number of times to really absorb what is taking place in terms of this music. My point right here is that music is changing. We're in the Renaissance. Our focus is going to be a church piece, a sacred composition. But one of the interesting things is that music is going to be moving more and more in a secular direction. There will be both, and composers will continue to write music both for the church and also for what we might loosely call entertainment. But it's during this time that that change begins to happen. Just to get us started, I have an image here on the left from a church. This actually was a well-known composer of the Renaissance, but I've included it to show you what was actually often the practice by this point, that they would have music written out, typically by hand, and they would share it from a very large lectern. We actually have some of these lecterns in museums, and so a few of them do still exist. But earlier music had been memorized, and we have evidence that really for a very long time they continued to memorize music. But we do see that they're beginning to have music written out and they're gathered around singing it. Over here we do see, though, printed music. When Gutenberg invented the printing press in 1450, it was right at 50 years later in Venice that a man figured out how to start printing music. It was a more involved process, but he figured out how to do that. And that's going to really lead to more and more secular music, more and more music making for enjoyment. people will learn how, they're learning how to read. Literacy is increasing thanks to the printing press. They're learning how to read, but they're also going to learn how to read music. And they will be learning to sing and to play musical instruments. And so secular music, and we will be listening when we get into the Baroque to pieces that would be more what we would consider entertainment music, as opposed to just music for the church. And so it's during this time that that trend begins. Some general characteristics of Renaissance sacred music. Just as with the Raphael work we were talking about, in the Renaissance, the goals are mind and beauty. Now, obviously, if you're dealing with music, you have to define those in a different way, but they're still focusing on those two things. The mind, in that they're sensitive to the words. And when you listen to the music, you might not think it's that easy. It is in Latin, and there will be, as we will be mentioning, groups. One group, like the sopranos, will come in, and then the altos, and then the tenors and the basses. But they will be jamming, as it were, on the same words. And so Josquin, in his piece, will have one section to kind of meditate on one set of words, and then he'll move to another set of words, etc. And so even though it may not seem tremendously easy for us to understand, compared to a lot of the music that had been created in the Middle Ages, the music is much easier to understand. And again, we didn't study the music of the Middle Ages, but they would often stretch words out like one syllable for 45 seconds so that you would lose track of what the words were. And so that's what I mean by sensitive to the words. Josquin is going to take section by section, and he'll often repeat the same phrase with the different vocal groups, the soprano, the alto, tenor, and bass. And so he's very, very sensitive to the words. We'll also be mentioning that he was sensitive to how the words were pronounced, which again might seem just sort of ordinary to us, but they were more and more aware that words were what appealed to the mind. And so we have this focus on the mind and the importance of words. Now, they also, just as artists would be using techniques such as contrapposto pose and perspective to create beauty, composers had similar sort of toolkits, as it were, techniques that they could use to create a work of beauty. Some of these will make sense to you, some of these may not. Again, I'm going to try to highlight the key, sort of the gist of this. But let me mention for a minute some of the choices they made to try to make the music be pleasing, what we might call pretty. The music tends to be calm and restrained. It tends to be laid back, easygoing. One person has said that listening to Renaissance music is like being wrapped in a warm blanket of peace. And so it's soothing, it's calm, it's laid back. There are no extremes of really, really loud and then really, really soft. No extremes. Tone color has to do with different instruments, and they focused on just the voice. So you're not going to have suddenly a trumpet blaring out or anything like that. They wanted everything. I often say it's kind of like Goldilocks in the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. They wanted their musical techniques to be just right. They wanted them to be pleasing, to be medium, not too loud, not too soft, not too high, not too low. They wanted everything to be pleasing and not extreme. So contrasts of dynamics, they avoided those. They avoided contrasts of tone color with throwing in some random instruments, or even rhythm. The note values are not agitated. The music tends to be very calm, very easygoing. Just to mention a term, the term a cappella means unaccompanied voices, and that's what this piece is, meaning that people are singing and there's no instrument such as a pipe organ that is accompanying them. It's kind of interesting. This is a little sidebar here, but a cappella is the term for that, and it means in the chapel style. And what they were actually referring to was at the Vatican, the Sistine Chapel. at the Sistine Chapel, and that was one of the places Josquin des Prez worked for a time. At the Sistine Chapel, the music was sung without any other sort of accompaniment, and so that was kind of the fashion of the day, and it came to be called in the chapel, meaning the Sistine Chapel style. I've mentioned rhythm already. It's just an easygoing, gentle flow, and we're going to be talking a minute about texture, how the lines of the music blend together. And again, they wanted them to combine in a pleasing, soothing, nice to listen to way. Now, our featured composer is Josquin des Prez, and I have in your notes some commentary about him, just a little bit about his life. He was a master of Renaissance music. He was very famous in Europe. One of his biggest fans referred to him as the master of the notes. That was Martin Luther, interestingly enough. Josquin died in 1521, and so their lives overlapped. And Luther was a big fan of Josquin's music, and by saying he's the master of the notes, what he meant was that Josquin really knows what he's doing, and he is able to make the music do what he wants it to do. And so again, a testimonial from one of Josquin's biggest fans, Martin Luther. He was a very, very versatile composer, writing mostly church music, but also some secular music. As you have in your notes, he was a contemporary of our painters that we've been talking about, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and I threw Columbus in there as well. So he's living and working during that era. He had jobs throughout Europe. As the so-called master of the notes, he was much sought after. And so in many ways, he could kind of command his price. Many people wanted to employ him. And so he did have some very prestigious jobs, particularly in France and in Italy. And he worked both at courts, employed by members of the nobility, kings, princes, that kind of thing, as well as for the church. In the summary of some of the information about Josquin, the last bullet there says he was known for a smooth flowing sound and sensitivity to the words. And that's kind of a nice statement that is understandable. I know earlier I talked about rhythm and tone color, and in a minute I'm going to talk a little bit more about some terminology. But that statement as to what he was known for is a good way to understand it, that he was known for a pleasing sound and sensitivity to the words. Now, some of those terms that I was going to mention. Our featured piece by Josquin des Prez is called Ave Maria Virgo Serena. More about what it's about in a moment. It's called a motet, which is kind of a fancy word for an anthem or a piece of special music. It was not officially part of the Mass. The words were not officially something you would find in the Mass, but it would have been appropriate for a worship service. And so again, religious words would have been appropriate, but it's not officially part of the Mass. I wanted to talk terms for a moment. First of all, musical texture. Texture is a term we use in music to talk about how the lines or the layers of music are put together. We've already used, and these three things here are sort of subsets. Musical texture is the general term. These are three types of musical texture. We've already talked about the first one, monophonic, one sound. And we said that Gregorian chant uses that texture, that whether one person sings or 1,000 people sing, in Gregorian chant they were singing one line of music. Everybody was singing the same tune, in other words, and so that is called monophonic. Over time, music became more complex. And in the Middle Ages and also in our time here in the Renaissance, a lot of the music is polyphonic, meaning many sounds. There are several things going on at once. We'll talk a little more about that a a little more specifically in a moment. But polyphonic music says that there are several layers. There are several things happening at the same time. Homophonic is a texture we'll talk about at the end of this piece. At the very end of the piece, there's a prayer, and at that point, everyone lines up. Homophonic meaning same sound. What it's really referring to in this piece is that everyone is singing the same words at the same time. And so whereas earlier with polyphony, their entrances are staggered. One group comes in, then another group comes in, then a third group and a fourth group, and then they all keep singing, kind of doing their own thing, but it blends together really nicely. But everyone is basically doing their own thing. In homophony, the music lines up more, so that again, they're all singing the same words at the same time, so it's easier, even easier still, to hear them and to understand them. So that is homophony. It would be like in church if someone were singing a hymn and they harmonized it. Usually now in church when we sing a hymn, everyone pretty much just sings the melody. But it used to be that often folks would harmonize. They would sing, some would sing the soprano, the melody, others would sing the alto, the tenor, and the bass. And so when everyone is singing together like that, that is what we call homophony. You might be singing A Mighty Fortress Is Our God or Amazing Grace, and everyone is singing the same words, but they would be singing somewhat different notes, but it would all blend well together. And so that is homophony. Josquin then, as I mentioned with that bullet that says he was known for a pleasing sound and sensitivity to the words, he is also sensitive to pronunciations. For example, the piece begins Ave Maria, and you would pronounce it more like, I stressed it, but you would pronounce it Ave Maria rather than, for example, Ave Maria. And so when he writes out the notes, he actually stretches out the syllable Maria in order to emphasize it. So that's just one example of his sensitivity to pronunciations, and he does that throughout the piece. Now, another term is imitation. It is a specific type of polyphony, and all it means is what I like to call the copycat technique. Josquin uses it a lot in this piece. It's similar to when you might sing Three Blind Mice or Row, Row, Row Your Boat, where one group would come in singing Row, Row, Row Your Boat, and then another group would come in singing Row, Row, Row Your Boat, etc. And again, everybody keeps singing and it blends together. Josquin uses that kind of a technique a lot in this piece, where he will have, for example, at the very beginning of the piece, the sopranos come in singing Ave Maria. They're going to continue in a moment with some more singing, and in the meantime, the altos have come in singing Ave Maria, and then the tenors, and then the basses. Again, think about Three Blind Mice or Row, Row, Row Your Boat. Groups coming in at different times, but singing the same music and the same words. And so that is what imitation is. It's not hard to understand. It's just a copycat type of technique. Now, I'd like you to look at the summary on page 56. Let's walk through these characteristics for a moment, and then we'll talk specifically about the words to the piece. Bottom of the page. This is bottom of page 56. As I say there, this is probably his most famous motet, probably his most famous piece. He wrote a lot of masses and various things, but this is the most talked about, the most studied piece by him. It was composed around the time of The Last Supper of Leonardo and the Pietà of Michelangelo. It has been nicknamed, and that's why Mona Lisa's picture is over here to the side, it has been nicknamed the Mona Lisa of music, not because it has anything to do with the subject of Mona Lisa, but it's just saying that this piece is as significant and as famous, at least to music lovers, as the Mona Lisa is to art lovers. And so it's been nicknamed the Mona Lisa of music, meaning that it is as significant in its field, the field of music, as the Mona Lisa to painting. Now, I talk about the text, and you have that up above on the same page. By the way, as we go through the text, we do have another painting here, one that we did not study. It is by Raphael, and it is Mary, obviously the Virgin Mary here, with Christ and John the Baptist in a beautiful sort of springtime pastoral setting. I've just included it here while we talk about the words and a little bit more about the music, because it's focusing on the Virgin Mary, and just as this is a very pleasing, beautiful, nice to look at painting, the music is very pleasing and beautiful and nice to listen to. As I highlight at the bottom of the page, this work praises the Virgin Mary, and it exists in a number of stanzas. And you've got what you're looking at here, of course, is the English translation. In your notes, you have both the Latin and the English. You remember that I referred back when we talked about the Romans. We saw the statue of Augustus of Prima Porta, and I said that that was his resume. In a way, this work is Mary's resume. What I mean by that is that it's making reference to her and to the teachings of the church about her. So the beginning stanza is a kind of a salutation, sort of acknowledging Mary and getting her attention, if you want to put it that way. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee, serene Virgin. And by the way, it is typically sung in Latin, and your recording will be, so you'll want to follow along with the words. Then you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stanzas, and you'll notice that I've put certain words in color. That's kind of that resume idea. These actually, of Mary, they were actually feasts of the church year. They were teachings that the church had about Mary and her role and her life, and they would have special days during the year to celebrate those things. And so this poem highlights those feast days, those days in honor of Mary. So we have a stanza talking about her, and it's all about her conception, birth, annunciation. We've talked about that before when the angel comes to tell her she's to be the mother of Christ, purification, and assumption. So again, teachings about Mary that the church was highlighting at this point. Now, as you're listening to the music, as I said, it will be sung in Latin. I want you to be trying to notice some of this copycat technique, some of this imitation as one group comes in, like the sopranos, and then the tenors, then the altos, etc. As these groups come in, then they all keep singing, but the music blends together. No train wrecks, no collisions. The notes blend together in a smooth, pleasing, nice to listen to way. So the choir will go through the salutation, those words, and then they will sing the words about her conception, her birth, etc. And then you get down to the end of the 5th stanza, and there will be a rest, a break. It's rather brief, but there'll be a short pause, and it calls attention. It sort of gets our attention because most of the music so far has been very flowing and smooth, but there's been something happening all of the time. And now all of a sudden, there's a pause. And that, again, is to get our attention, because Josquin really wants us to hear and to think about the prayer. And the prayer was, O Mother of God, remember me, Amen. And so after that break that really tries to get our attention and to say, here comes something special, at that point, when they sing that prayer, they sing it in homophony. And so almost all of the rest of this, and for our purposes, we'll just say that really all of this is in polyphony, woven together, many lines of music weaving together, but now they line up and say in one accord, we might put it, the prayer. And so that is using the technique called homophony. So what we see is that as we're ending the Renaissance and looking ahead now to the Baroque, what we see is that during this high Renaissance era, whatever your medium, if you were using paint, as Raphael did, or you were using notes and rhythms and pitches, all of those things that a composer would use, they were making choices to appeal to the mind. They wanted the listener to hear all of these different attributes of Mary and to hear this prayer. So Josquin is making choices to appeal to the mind, and he's making choices that will make the work beautiful, that will make it pleasing to listen to. We turn now to the beginning of the Baroque. And I have, I think, a pretty helpful summary in your notes of what was going on. The Baroque begins right around 1600 in Rome, and it lasts about 150 years. In your notes, as you look at the first page of the Baroque, and then if you flip through at some point to later sections of the Baroque unit, you'll see that I've broken it up into categories. After we have some introductory material, we will be focusing first on the Catholic or Counter-Reformation Baroque, and I tend to use those terms interchangeably. But we will first be looking at art created in Rome for the Catholic Church. After we do that, we will, in later lectures, be looking at art for the aristocracy, for the upper classes, so in other words, secular art, such as the Palace at Versailles and a sculpture of a mythological story, Apollo and Daphne. And then we will be looking at the Baroque for the upper middle class, which was in Holland, and that will bring us to Rembrandt and Vermeer, and another artist who isn't as well known, but who focused on the still life. So we begin with the Baroque in Rome right around 1600. And as I said, after talking general characteristics, we will first be looking at art for the Catholic Church. So the situation is that, as you know, Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the Wittenberg door in 1517, and that sparks ultimately a split in the church. And so we end up with Europe divided. You see a map over here, roughly north and south, but that's very rough. But the yellow here showing that the closer to Italy you were, the more folks were likely to remain Catholic, and then more in the north, Lutheran, for example, with this pinkish color in Germany and Scandinavia. And then there's a breakdown with Calvinists, etc. But we end up with a split in the church. And one of the things that's going to result from that is the question of what should be the role of art. And Protestants and Catholics are going to come up with different answers. We will mostly be focusing on the Catholic answer to that. I'll make reference a little bit later on to the Protestant view, but the Catholic version is what we will focus on because that is where the Baroque begins, and that's really the impetus for the Baroque, is using art for worship. So what happened was, with Martin Luther nailing those 95 Theses to the Wittenberg door and moving forward with what ultimately would be this dramatic split in the church, the Catholic Church ended up having a series of meetings called the Council of Trent. You see the dates there, 1545 to 1563. Most of their concerns had to do, understandably, with theological issues and various practices of the church. They only got around to talking about art and music toward the end of all of their deliberations, which again is understandable. But they did eventually make some statements regarding their view of the arts and how they should be used in worship. And so the Council of Trent said, our goal is to inspire worshipers, to impress them, and the way I like to put it is to make church the place to be. They wanted to make worship exciting and to make people want to be there. So they said, we want to inspire and we want to teach. And quite often, they're going to be highlighting the doctrines of the church, the ideas regarding the Pope, saints, and the Virgin Mary, and we will see some of that as we move forward. Their focus then was to downplay the mind. They felt really that Renaissance humanism had led to their troubles with the split in the church, and so they wanted to downplay the Renaissance humanism's use of the mind, rationality, and independent thinking, and instead they wanted to stress emotion, what some people refer to as religious ecstasy. As one author has put it, they wanted viewers to feel what was going on, not just think about it. Again, to feel what was going on, not just think about it. One of the people who maybe helps us to understand this or to see what was going on was St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order and the author of the Spiritual Exercises. The Spiritual Exercises was a book that basically was like a devotional book. And we can see there that the focus of the church becomes an experiential, emotional faith. And so the goal was that you would be sort of swept away by emotion. An example of that comes from St. Ignatius of Loyola's discussion of hell. If a Protestant theologian were going to be talking about hell, they would talk about it most likely intellectually, citing scriptures, what we know about hell from the scriptures. They would be citing those and sort of intellectually talking about hell, ultimately saying it's a bad place and you don't want to go there. St. Ignatius's focus was to basically take you there, to sort of tap into your imagination and say, imagine you're in hell. It is hot, you're thirsty. You get the idea. And so he would talk about sort of the experience of hell to make you live it, as it were, and that would, of course, incite the emotions and certainly make you want to take action so as not to go there. But there's a different focus from the intellectual focus that the Renaissance had espoused and what Protestantism would stress as well. Just a quote from the Council of Trent regarding the arts, with a lovely view of St. Peter's in the background here in the Tiber River. The Council of Trent said that they wanted to counter the Protestant threat. And they said, we want to do that by means of the stories of the mysteries of our redemption portrayed by paintings or other representations whereby the people shall be instructed and confirmed in the habit of remembering and continually revolving in mind the articles of faith. So we want to focus on the mysteries of the faith, and that's really where emotion comes in many respects, and the habit of remembering, and again, to make faith exciting. You have in your notes a listing of some of the key artistic characteristics of the time: space, time, and light. We will see how these play out as we look at various works. For now, I just want to mention the terms, but we will see that works reach out into space. They sometimes deal with the passage of time. Artists are going to be very much fascinated with light and with energy. The art is going to tend to be over the top. It's going to be very expensive, very extravagant, and it's going to focus on emotion, focusing in particular on tugging at the heartstrings. What you see here is a ceiling painting in Rome, and the artist has very skillfully used a fool the eye technique, as we call it, using perspective in such a way to show St. Ignatius of Loyola being received into heaven, but you also see many people who are being plunged down into hell. And so we see that use of the techniques, the artistic techniques that have been developed, and using them now toward emotion, toward drama and awe and emotion. Just to remind you, we see the pendulum or the scales shifting back and forth between reason and emotion. a stress on the mind or a stress on the emotions. And now we have tilted very much toward the emotions. As you have written in your notes, the focus of the Renaissance had been to teach, in other words, to appeal to the mind. The focus of the Baroque is going to be to touch, to emphasize the emotions. Now, I want us to look at a couple of works at the Vatican by Bernini, and we'll be looking next class also at some works by Bernini. This is St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Sistine Chapel is right over here to the side, and this is the sprawling Vatican Museum. But our focus right now is here. This work called the Piazza. We might loosely call it a square, but it certainly is not square shaped, but a courtyard or square in front of the basilica. Bernini was hired to create this. What he did was to clear out what had been a very jumbled, messy tangle of old streets and buildings, and it was just kind of junky, and you didn't get a really good view of St. Peter's. And so what he did here was to clear all of that out and instead then give this oval plus a trapezoid here, this shape, to give a very impressive, suitable approach to the basilica. As I've noted here, it was modified in the 1930s by Mussolini, who was the one who added this avenue so that the approach would be even grander. And so we see that a grand approach that was added for political reasons in the 1930s. But in his day, Bernini said that his goal was to suggest with these arm-like structures surrounding people the motherly arms of the church. He wanted it to be welcoming and to encourage people to stay with the faith, to stay with the church. So it's been referred to as the motherly arms of the church. When you look at the work from a distance, you see these little white pegs sticking up. It's kind of hard to tell from a distance. These are actually sculptures. All the way around you have sculptures of people. And this is a reminder of the New Testament verse that refers to a cloud of witnesses. The idea here is encouraging people to stay with the church. And so the message would be, as you approach this, all of these people were a part of the faith. You should stay with the faith as well. And so it's encouraging people by history, by the historical figures who had gone before. Of particular importance was the historical figure of St. Peter. And in the New Testament, Jesus says to him, I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And because of that verse, first of all, St. Peter is often referred to as the first pope, the Bishop of Rome, the first pope, the founder of the papacy. And he's often his attribute, his symbol is a key. And so you see him here holding this very large key in this sculpture of St. Peter, after whom, of course, the church is named. And he's one of these peg-like sculptures that we see along the exterior here. But Peter will be very important in terms of one of the works we're going to see on the inside of the church as well. And it's interesting with regard to the key, even though Bernini said, yes, I had in mind the motherly arms of the church, some people have pointed out that this shape that I'm marking out here, this oval shape plus the trapezoidal shape, looks like an old-fashioned keyhole. And so it's possible that there's a reference to the keys to the kingdom and St. Peter, as well as Bernini trying to give us the welcoming motherly arms of the church, welcoming her children in to worship. Now I'm going to stop there for today. We have several more works by Bernini to look at, so we'll be continuing now that we've been on the inside of St. Peter's. Next class we will step inside to see two of the masterpieces created by Gian Lorenzo Bernini.